Welcome to this video where we'll discuss Electronic Arts. This week, we learned that Need for Speed is simply over, that there are no other games from the franchise in development, and that the studio that usually worked on it, Criterion Studio, would never work on a Need for Speed again, because now it's a studio entirely dedicated to Battlefield. I covered this news pretty quickly the day it was announced because I already had other content and other videos planned. But I wanted to come back to this news. I wanted to make a dedicated video on the subject, because what you need to know is that by stopping Need for Speed, Electronic Arts simply killed one of its last remaining racing game franchises. The only one that still survives for now is the F1 game franchise, but it's not certain how much longer that will last because the last game in the F1 series came out in 2025. There wasn't an F1 2026 because now Electronic Arts prefers to release DLCs that add the new season's content to an already released game, so now it's the 2026 F1 season. But this 2026 update kind of flopped. You know, it didn't sell very well. And now at Electronic Arts, anything that doesn't sell well or doesn't sell well enough gets dropped. That's why they killed off Need for Speed this week. And believe me, it's not the first time Electronic Arts has done this. In fact, in recent years, they've really killed off a large number of racing game franchises. Today, I wanted to go back over all those times when Electronic Arts, which just a few months ago defined itself as the home of racing games, basically the hub for racing games, all those times when Electronic Arts decided to stop one of its racing game franchises and betray all the fans of those different franchises. So today, let's take a quick look at the dead racing game franchises at Electronic Arts. I hope you'll enjoy this video concept. If that's the case, feel free to leave a like, subscribe for future videos, and use my link, which will be in the description and pinned comment under this video, to buy your games cheaper while giving a little support to my channel. You'll be helping me out a lot. So of course, don't worry. In this video, we'll talk about modern games, but I still wanted to start this video with an older racing game that Electronic Arts discontinued in the early 2000s, Road Rash. The game had a kind of weird concept: illegal motorcycle races where you could attack other riders, making it a racing combat game. This game series sold well in the late 90s but began to flop in the early 2000s with its final title, Jailbreak, because Electronic Arts wanted to slightly change the game's concept at the time. They wanted to move away from the violent combat aspect to focus more on the driving side, in order to attract a wider audience and bring in players who were originally put off by the really violent side of the early games in the series. Except that it didn't work out, because at the time, those who wanted driving games turned to more realistic games, which were also technically much more advanced, like Gran Turismo 2, for example. Fans who enjoyed the brutal aspects of the old games didn't like it. As a result, it didn't sell well, and at the time, Electronic Arts decided to stop the series to focus on the Need for Speed franchise, which back then was still considered one of the kings of the racing game genre. So it wasn't a failure, but EA let it die simply because Need for Speed was bringing in more money. And you'll see that this pattern shows up a lot with Electronic Arts games. For example, with the Burnout franchise. It's likely the franchise that suffered most at Electronic Arts. Not due to poor sales, since Burnout Paradise and Burnout 3 were actually major commercial successes. Except that Electronic Arts also wanted to focus more on Need for Speed by turning the studio that developed Burnout at the time, Criterion, into a Need for Speed studio. And that's a real shame because even though Need for Speed and Burnout are both arcade games, Burnout was a completely different style of game. It was absolutely brutal. You were always smashing others into the walls, always driving really fast. It was extremely fast-paced. Burnout Paradise, the last Burnout game released, was a strong seller and well-received. It was also the franchise's first and only open-world title, as previous games featured closed circuits. An extremely well-rated game, still considered today as one of the best arcade racing games ever made. But back then, Electronic Arts did exactly the same thing as with Road Rash. They decided that, commercially speaking, it was more interesting to bet everything on Need for Speed, and they abandoned Burnout, which still had a game release in 2018. They released a remaster of Burnout Paradise 10 years after its original release, and I don't understand why. I think they did that to see if it could catch on, if there was any interest in reinvesting money in developing a new Burnout, by seeing if this one sold well or not. They really made zero effort. It's a remaster with almost no changes compared to the original game. So obviously, those who had the original game weren't interested in this one. It didn't sell very well. And Electronic Arts moved on for good. In 2021, Electronic Arts announced something crazy. They bought the studio Codemasters for $1.2 billion. Codemasters was a major studio specialized in racing games. They had the F1 license, the Dirt license, Dirt Rally, Grid, project cars. They bought everything at once, supposedly to take advantage of Codemasters' expertise and have them develop a whole bunch of new racing games that were supposed to be released by Electronic Arts. Spoiler alert, They did exactly the opposite, as you probably realized from listening to the introduction of this video. The only Codemasters franchise that survived after being bought out is the F1 franchise, which still exists. Everything else is gone. So, with Dirt, Electronic Arts really went all out because they didn't just kill one franchise at once, but actually two, namely Dirt and Dirt Rally, whose last game, Dirt Rally 2, came out in 2019 and is still considered by many players to be one of the best rally games ever made. Maybe less so now that there's a Seto Rally, but overall it's excellent. Dirt Rally had a promising future. It was a game that sold well and had a good reputation. They were developing a Dirt Rally 3, except that Electronic Arts decided to meddle, and that was the end of it. A few months before being bought by Electronic Arts, Codemasters had obtained the official license for the World Rally Championship, the famous WRC. As a result, Electronic Arts ended up with two competing franchises, WRC and Dirt WRC, which was previously developed by Kyloton. So, two different licenses. Electronic Arts thought it was pointless and decided to sacrifice one of them, Dirt. In 2023, they released EA Sports WRC, which was supposed to be a mix between Dirt Rally and WRC. Basically, it was supposed to be a kind of Dirt Rally 3, but with the official teams and drivers from the WRC Championship. Overall, it's a game that was quite well received by players. The physics were excellent. The content was still quite substantial, even though the game was far from perfect at launch. There were quite a few bugs, optimization and performance issues. And actually, graphically, the game looked a bit outdated. It didn't look as good as Dirt Rally 2, which had come out 6 years earlier. So it's a game that got pretty good reviews but didn't sell that well. As a result, on April 30, 2025, Electronic Arts officially announced that there are simply no more rally games in development. Electronic Arts sold the WRC license to Kyloton and ended up with no rally games at all, since they had just finished Dirt and Dirt Rally and no longer have WRC. Truly brilliant work. At least WRC and Dirt Rally got 2 years at Electronic Arts before being killed off. That wasn't the case for Project Cars. It's the racing license that belonged to Codemasters that was killed off the fastest by Electronic Arts. Because less than 2 years after buying Codemasters, who developed Project Cars 3, and were actually working on Project Cars 4 and Project Cars Mobile, Electronic Arts announced that Project Cars was dead. We don't really know why, because in fact Project Cars 3, the last officially released game in the series, didn't sell very well. They actually tried to make a game with broader appeal, back when it didn't belong to Electronic Arts yet, I should point out. It didn't really go over well, even though the game was pretty good. It disappointed the longtime fans of the series. It didn't manage to win over fans of Gran Turismo, Need for Speed, or Motorsport. Sales weren't very good, but Codemasters thought there was still enough potential to return to simulation and develop Project Cars 4. That wasn't an opinion shared by Electronic Arts because on November 8, 2022, EA officially announced, and I quote, "After evaluating the long-term growth potential of the next Project Cars, we decided to stop all development and investment in the franchise." In other words, Electronic Arts thought it wouldn't sell well enough and that there was no point in putting money into it. And honestly, maybe they weren't wrong because Project Cars 4 became Project Motors Racing, which is a more simulation-focused game than Project Cars 3, but it still didn't sell very well. In their statement, Electronic Arts also explained that they want to focus their investments on franchises with the most growth potential. You kind of have to wonder which ones, since there aren't really any left. There's one franchise whose future is still uncertain for now, and that's Grid. Grid isn't officially dead, Grid is on an indefinite pause. In other words, since Grid Legends came out in 2022 and flopped, not at all because it's a bad game, because honestly, the game is pretty fun to play. Graphically, it's acceptable and everything that comes with it, but more because it's a game with a somewhat shaky positioning. In the 2020s, nobody wants to play circuit racing games with arcade driving anymore. Either people want arcade, but with open-world gameplay like Forza Horizon, or people want circuit racing, but in that case, they want the most realistic driving possible, sim racing. Grid was caught between two worlds and had poor sales. Anyway, in any case, everything seems to indicate that because even though Electronic Arts never released its official sales figures, there are several clues that show the game didn't achieve huge success. Communication was minimal before launch, and content and Season Pass updates stopped soon after release. Although Electronic Arts hasn't officially discontinued Grid, there hasn't been anything new in the franchise for 4 years. Honestly, it's hard to see why Electronic Arts would back this franchise, as it's likely one of the most niche. There's also Real Racing. Now, you can't say that Electronic Arts didn't try to keep it alive, because Real Racing 3 still lasted 12 years from 2013 to almost 2026. It's a game that was appreciated by players, downloaded more than 500 million times. We're talking about a free game available on smartphones. There was supposed to be a Real Racing 4 in development. Since 2020, the studio had been working on it. Except that, at that time, Electronic Arts decided instead to extend the life of Real Racing 3, and redirect investment to keep producing content for it, before officially announcing the shutdown of the servers on March 19th, 2026, officially ending the series. Even if the franchise isn't officially dead, the chance of a sequel is very slim. No one worked on Real Racing 4 after 2020, and the studio that developed it was dismantled and restructured to work on The Sims, making it unrelated. It was a real disaster at Electronic Arts when it comes to racing games. Until now, there was still EA's king of racing games was still hanging on, Need for Speed. We just learned that Criterion, the studio behind the latest Need for Speed games, has officially merged with the Battlefield studio. Initially, we believed the goal was to address Battlefield 6's development delay, and that after its launch, Criterion would regain its independence and go back to developing a new Need for Speed. Well, no, not at all, because it was just announced that Criterion will become a long-term Battlefield development studio. So we won't be seeing them develop a new Need for Speed anytime soon. The main question I want you to answer in the comments is if the recent Need for Speed games were worth it, since they don't match the quality of games from the 2000s. Need for Speed has really gone through a long downward spiral since 2010 or 2015. More precisely, it was around 2017 with the release of Need for Speed Payback. Here, we have a game that was developed by Ghost Games at the time, and once you take away the nice graphics and the beautiful cutscenes, there's honestly not much left. Need for Speed Payback has terrible handling with the brake-to-drift mechanic that lets you take corners at 300 km/h while drifting. The map is extremely empty. There's not even any police in the open world. We have some very annoying characters, and except for a few well-scripted missions with good gameplay and cutscenes, the game is actually boring. Payback sold pretty well, but it was already looking like a bad sign for the quality of Need for Speed games. Then there's Need for Speed Heat, which came out and maybe raised the level a little bit, except that along the way, Electronic Arts decided to shut down Ghost Games Studio and reassign the development of Need for Speed Heat updates to Criterion, except Criterion said, well, no, actually, this isn't our game. It's Ghost Games' game, so we're not going to make any updates for it. Even though there were things planned for it. Leaks teased some cool updates, including a Forza Horizon-style season system for the game, but it never happened. Ghost Games is gone. Need for Speed was completely taken over by Criterion, who developed Need for Speed Unbound, which was, I think, the worst Need for Speed in the series. The game was heavily criticized from the very first trailers, from the first images of the game, because of its graphic style that mixed an animated look, ultra-bright colors with cell shading, and an environment that looked pretty realistic. We had beautiful photorealistic graphics for the environments and cars, but the characters looked like manga or cartoons. People didn't like that. Even though driving has improved and there's slightly more customization than in the last two Need for Speed games, this is probably the worst Need for Speed ever in terms of story. It's a game that Electronic Arts actually invested quite a lot in, since they supported it for almost 3 years. There were quite a few seasons released for the game, and a lot of multiplayer modes. And honestly, and this is something I really regret, I think it was the best arcade multiplayer game. You could play as a cop to stop your friends in multiplayer. You could have police chases with your friends, against the police controlled by the game's AI. There were extraction modes, drag races, drifting. It was extremely complete in the end, except the problem is that Unbound didn't sell very well. That's the issue. It's a game that was very, very expensive, including the updates, and it's a game that didn't manage to win people over precisely because of that very particular artistic direction. So, it didn't sell well, and because of that, out of the 10 racing franchises that Electronic Arts owns, there's only one left that's still alive, and that's it. The question is, for how much longer? Because, as I explained earlier, the franchise isn't doing very well either, and it could disappear. Fortunately, in a few months, to end on a positive note, the game Clutch is coming out, and it seems to be inspired by Need for Speed and Forza. So if you like the story-driven side, the slightly arcade, fast and furious vibe of Need for Speed, you should be able to find that in Clutch. I've made quite a few videos about the game. If you want to see what it looks like, feel free to go take a look. In any case, I hope this video, which gives a bit of an overview of what's happening at Electronic Arts, was interesting to you. I hope I covered everything and helped you better understand the extent of the damage at Electronic Arts. If so, support my channel for free by liking, subscribing, and following me on Twitch, where I stream racing and other games. Feel free to follow me and use your Prime sub. It always makes me happy. See you tomorrow for a classic video. Take care. Bye.